Everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on the Sanitation Technology Funder Landscape. This webinar is being brought to you by the Sanitation Technology Platform, otherwise known as STEP. My name is Kirsten Reith. I'm the Director of Research and Insights for RTI International's Innovation Advisors Group, and I'll be serving as your moderator today. Before we get started, I'd like to go over some housekeeping items. First of all, I would like to mention that this webinar will be recorded and placed on the STEP website so that we can share this information broadly. Audio will be broadcast over your computer speakers. Everyone has been muted. However, please let our host, Cameron, know through the chat pod if you need assistance. He is our technical expert and will be assisting you if you have technical difficulties. And right now, if you would please test the chat box by typing in hello. There will be a few poll questions during today's webinar. So you will click on the radio button when you see the poll and to answer what suits your response for the multiple choice questions. For open-ended questions, please enter your response into the text box and hit enter. We really want to make this interactive, and so we please ask for your participation in these question and answers. As the presenters are going along, please submit your questions at any time using the chat feature, and we are monitoring that, and we will make our best attempt to answer those directly, or if time is tight, we would save them for the end. We are planning to have a Q&A session at the end. There will be a quick survey link provided also at the end of the webinar that we would appreciate your feedback on, and so this will really help us in thinking about what to improve and look for in the next time we do these sessions. So let's get started. So the first thing, before we jump in, I'm really curious to know, how did you hear about this webinar? This is actually the STEP program's first public webinar, and you are our inaugural audience, so congratulations. We really want to maximize our outreach moving forward, so it's really helpful for us to understand how you found out about this opportunity. I will give you a minute to answer the poll question here. Great. So it looks like the majority of you were recommended that you participate, and that's great. And it looks like second most was through our STEP partner newsletter. So I'm really glad to hear that you're reading that and that you're appreciating that. Great. All right, well, as I mentioned, my name is Kirsten Reith, and I'm serving as your moderator today. But really, the star of the show is Amanda Rose, and you'll be hearing from her shortly. She leads our market readiness support for the Sanitation Technology Platform, and she served as the lead author of the recently published Sanitation Technology Funder Landscape that we'll be talking about today. Okay, well, now that I've briefly introduced myself and Amanda, we would like to learn a bit about you in the audience. And so as you see on these slides, we're asking you the question, how would you describe your role? And if you would please, in the chat box, answer, we'd love to know, how would you describe your role in the sanitation landscape? Are you a technology entrepreneur, actively seeking funding? Are you affiliated with a nonprofit that supports entrepreneurs? Would you classify yourself as a funder? So any input that you add in the chat box would be great so that we can learn a little bit more about you. All right. And Cameron, if you could broadcast the results, we can see, really, everybody can see who else is part of the conversation. Well, great. So it looks like the majority of you are researchers or consultants seeking to better understand the sanitation technology funder landscape, and that's great. That's what we're here to talk about. There's a few sanitation technology entrepreneurs, and good. I hope that you will learn some good information today as well. There's a lot of other here too, implementing organizations supporting sanitation entrepreneurs, developing sanitation markets, working with governments to better understand funding options. Those are all really great to hear. Okay, so the agenda for our discussion will follow this flow. I'll provide a brief introduction of the Sanitation Technology Platform, and then I'll hand it over to Amanda to really unpack the financing pioneer gap and discuss some resources for bridging this gap. We will close, like I said, with a question and answer session. We really want this hour to feel like a shared discussion for you, not just a one-way presentation of information from us. So throughout the webinar, we have prompts to ask for your feedback. And if you have questions for Amanda during the presentation, feel free to add them to the chat box. And that, like I said, we are monitoring those questions, and we will try to answer them as we go along the way. One last thing to mention, I talked about the feedback survey at the end of the presentation, but to let you know, this is the first in a series of 6 webinars that we plan to run throughout the rest of the year. So again, your input will help us prioritize content and help us provide improved formatting for the future webinars. Okay, so let me just tell you a little bit about the Sanitation Technology Platform, or STEP as we call it. It de-risks and accelerates transformative sanitation solutions to market. And so I'm sure, as most of you understand, even under the best conditions, going to market with transformative sanitation solutions can be very complex and a very challenging undertaking. So what STEP does is it helps partners navigate this terrain. So specifically, we offer 3 core services within this platform. First of all, we offer a turnkey process for field testing emerging sanitation technologies, so both integrated systems and also individual components. So, and we have this testing in real-world settings, mainly through our field testing platform in India. And then secondly, we gather user insights through a qualitative and quantitative method to inform new product design and support data-driven decisions as these technologies are being developed. And then thirdly, we leverage technical expertise and market insight to clarify the value propositions and the go-to-market strategies for sanitation solutions. To let you know that RTI, the organization that Amanda and I are with, is an independent nonprofit research institute, and our mission is dedicated to improving the human condition by turning knowledge into practice. And so we serve as the implementing partner of STEP, and the STEP platform is funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So with that, I'm going to hand the microphone over to Amanda, and she will take us through our findings on the Sanitation Technology Funder Landscape. As I mentioned, Amanda serves as the Market Readiness Lead for STEP, and she has dedicated her career to supporting innovation-led development efforts in both agricultural and sanitation sectors. And I know we're all eager to hear what she has to share. Amanda?
Hi, everyone. Good morning or good evening, depending on where you're calling in from. It's great to be with you today. Thanks for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us. So today, as we discuss the Sanitation Technology Funder Landscape, just want to give you kind of the high-level narrative that we're going to be discussing today so you know where we're heading. So, in starting this work, we understood early that in emerging markets, there tends to be plenty of later stage capital available for proven solutions. However, resources to validate and prepare markets for new sanitation technologies and business models, which are prerequisites for achieving sustainable scaled solutions, tend to be pretty scarce. and thus a problematic funding pioneer gap emerges. In reviewing the Sanitation Technology Funder Landscape, we honed in on two types of funding that exhibit promise for addressing this gap. Enterprise philanthropy as a great place for sanitation technology entrepreneurs to start, and emerging blended finance mechanisms that hold a great deal of promise, but maybe aren't quite ready to be tapped into, but things are really changing, and we feel like this is a great set of resources for sanitation technology entrepreneurs to have on their radar. And overall, we understand that continued leadership and creativity are needed among both funders and entrepreneurs as we all work to bridge the pioneer gap and advance transformative sanitation solutions. Now, as I mentioned, our starting point for this work was the sanitation technology entrepreneur. These Sanitech entrepreneurs are individuals who are developing and entering markets with breakthrough products and services tailored to meet the sanitation needs of the global poor. We purposefully emphasize the word technology in this title because we understand that having a product focus, even when coordinated with service delivery, it presents some unique challenges in the funder landscape that we wanted to address head on. While we looked at the sanitation technology funder landscape from a global perspective, we also tried to hone in on three key geographies: Bangladesh, India, and South Africa. Our process included a mix of primary and secondary research. We reviewed over 200 leads, again, some operating at the global level and others within those specific geographies. The key outputs of this work included a high-level report, some excerpts of which you're going to see today, and a funder database, which currently lists 64 promising leads that we think should be brought to the attention of sanitation technology entrepreneurs. Both of these resources are available for download on our website. As we jump in, I want to reference a few of the funder types that we're going to be speaking to today so that the definitions are clear and we're all kind of understanding what we're talking about. So this work primarily focuses on three types of resource providers. You see the blue box is titled Catalytic Capital. These are two types of funders that are kind of well known for providing that early stage kind of risk tolerant capital, whether those are through philanthropic donors or bilateral aid organizations that kind of go into the early stage where proof points are needed to draw in other investors later. So philanthropic donors typically include your family foundations and foundations of high net worth individuals that support grant making across a host of priorities, of which sanitation typically is one. Bilateral aid organizations are those national aid organizations that really represent the national interests in the development sphere. These organizations have been coming strong in supporting innovation for development in the last many years. And then you see in the gray box a note about impact investors. This was a cohort that we wanted to better understand their current role, what role they're playing in the sanitation technology funder landscape. These are return-seeking investors, even though they do have priority around making social and environmental impact alongside their investments. They really do seek to also reap a financial return on their investment. So I want to be clear about what you're not going to see today. We had to draw some boundaries on this exercise. And so we did not delve deeply into funding provided via municipal government programs, multilateral development banks, and commercial lenders. While these entities are absolutely critical in the sanitation technology funder landscape, they were not the priority for this effort. So one of our objectives was trying to understand how funders, whether those are philanthropic donors or investors, how they perceive the sanitation technology funder landscape, how they perceive opportunity associated with sanitation technology entrepreneurs. So we understand that these Sanitech entrepreneurs have unique potential to drive innovation and impact in the sanitation sector. These individuals are poised to open up entirely new markets and industry sectors, serve consumers in new and different ways, and really be an experimental force within the sanitation sector. As we were doing this work, one cohort that really we tried to keep front of mind are those inventors and entrepreneurs who are working to, quote unquote, reinvent the toilet per a call to action by the Gates Foundation in 2011. These are individuals that STEP works closely with, and we tried to keep them in our heads as we conducted this landscaping. And certainly you all probably have specific cohorts of entrepreneurs that you know and love and that represent those individuals that are out seeking resources in the Sanitech funder landscape. Now, while these individuals hold a lot of promise and potential, they also face some pretty significant challenges in accessing funding. So in talking with funders, donors, and investors, we heard a number of these financing barriers come up in conversation time and again. Some of these barriers are specific to being technology entrepreneurs. So they typically operate asset-intensive ventures. A lot of these individuals are pushing boundaries in terms of the technologies, the products, the services they're trying to deliver. And thus, you might be dealing with longer time horizons than perhaps in some other spheres. Others of these boundaries or barriers are specific to the sanitation sector. And these are ones that we really heard primarily come up in conversations. Specifically, the lack of scalable business models within the sanitation sector just really looms large. It's a tough nut to crack for funders and for entrepreneurs. And so this was a principal barrier that we kept coming across. Secondly, I think funders of all types understand that really transformative long-term sanitation solutions are context specific. And they understand that, to really grapple with context, you have to have a high bar for evidence. What is the evidence of market traction, of consumer demand? All of those things really loom large for the sanitation sector, and funders have that on their radar. You see on the right that we have a couple of quotes directly from interviews. We have more of this type of input in our report that you can review. So what does this mean? It means that there's a great deal of uncertainty for Sanitech entrepreneurs, especially in those middle phases of transition where they are trying to validate new technologies and business models and prepare for market entry. So you see on your screen an image of the Blueprint to Scale journey, which was first introduced by the Monitor Group in their Blueprint to Scale report. Really great read if anyone is interested. The Lemelson Foundation built on this framework, and they identified two particularly tough, challenging transition points that entrepreneurs face. So in moving from blueprint to validating products and business models in real-world environments, they found that in India, an enterprise could need as much as $50,000 to $500,000 in new resource investments to make that transition above and beyond initial seed capital. And then we see that the second tough transition comes when you move from validating technologies and business models, moving into preparing for market entry. And Lemelson found that the resource needs become pretty wide-ranging at that point. Pilot testing in real-world environments proves to be a critical but often unmet need in this process. And what you see is that entrepreneurs end up having to really bootstrap their way through these stages and pull on personal savings, maybe friends and family to make these things happen. And, in emerging market contexts, I think we can all appreciate that some of those resources may be a bit more limited than in other contexts. The Lemelson Foundation found that in India, across this whole process, a new invention-based enterprise may require as much as US $25 million in capital over 7 to 10 years before turning consistent profits at a substantial scale. I mean, that's real resources there. And so I think we have to be cognizant of the scope of investment that we're talking about as we consider the experiences of these Sanitech entrepreneurs. So all of this kind of comes together into a central conundrum that I think we have to be facing head on. So we see that impact and other late stage investors require evidence of market traction and scalable business models. But then resources for pilot testing technologies and validating business models in real world environments, exactly the experimentation needed to build this evidence base, proved to be some of the most challenging resources for entrepreneurs to find. So consequently, pilots often occur in a one-off bootstrap fashion. Their evidence base of their solution remains limited, and examples of success remain isolated. And thus you have impact and other later stage investors reticent to invest, and their wait and see mentality continues. And you have this kind of perpetuating cycle. And this is really a central conundrum, a challenge facing sanitation technology entrepreneurs who are navigating that pioneer gap. So I want to pause and just get a pulse check from you all. And just curious, how do these findings resonate with your experience? Do you find yourself kind of nodding your head? Are there distinctions that you would like to make based on your experience? I'd love your input. And just, if anybody has any feedback, you're welcome to add it. As we go along, maybe just keep pondering these. Okay, I'm getting some evidence of head nodding. Yes, people are kind of with it or with me in this. Okay, hopefully I haven't lost anyone yet. If I have, you can call that out as well. All right, wonderful. Okay, so good. We have some resonance. So I think we can move on because now we get to really get to the fun part of the presentation. I understand that I kind of brought you there to a low point. I don't want you to despair because the good news is that there are resources to bridge the pioneer gap. And it's really a question of where to look. And so that's where we're going to spend the remaining time we have today, focusing on bridging the pioneer gap. So as we were undertaking this landscaping exercise, we found that there were two funding opportunities that hold particular promise for bridging the pioneer gap. By no means are these the only opportunities, but there are two that we wanted to bring to your attention today. The first is enterprise philanthropy. You'll see a definition there. The way I think about enterprise philanthropy is really philanthropy with a profit motive. And not profit necessarily for the resource provider, but rather for the resource recipient. These are philanthropic dollars that are going into market-based solutions. These are existing resources available now. This represents a great place for Sanitech entrepreneurs to start their search. We also hone in on blended finance. This is the strategic use of development finance and philanthropic funds to mobilize private capital into emerging and frontier markets. So really trying to incentivize impact and other investors to go into sectors and geographies that maybe they wouldn't go on their own. We found that this is a promising future possibilities, but not yet optimized for Sanitech entrepreneurs. What is interesting about these two kind of buckets of opportunity is that they are quite complementary in nature when you look at the blueprint to scale journey. So you see that enterprise philanthropy is well positioned to take on early stage pre-commercial risk that then tees up later stage investment. And then emerging blended finance mechanisms help bring additional private capital to the table kind of at the later stage of this process. And then a question becomes, well, how can we really strategically leverage enterprise philanthropy so that it helps draw blended finance further upstream in the blueprint to scale process so that we have better coverage of resources within the validate and prepare stages? So we're going to quickly kind of review some resources within the enterprise philanthropy sphere. I love this quote from Judith Rodin. I think it really speaks to the essence of this bucket of funding. She says, philanthropy must do what it does best, peel back the first layer of risk and experiment where other sectors cannot, making development and commercial investment dollars more productive and less risky. In our report, we highlight 5 specific enterprise philanthropy resources. And by no means are we saying that these are the only ones. Rather, we highlight these with profiles such that you can see kind of the diversity of enterprise philanthropy resources available. You see that these institutions kind of operate at different parts of the Blueprint to Scale journey. They also have, unique priorities that resource seekers should take into account as they go about their resource seeking process. Global Innovation Fund is a pooled innovation funding resource. They offer 3 levels of funding across the Blueprint to Scale journey. Humanitarian Innovation Fund kind of operates at the nexus between humanitarian settings and WASH. They've run 12 WASH challenges to date. The median size grant for that fund in the WASH sector is about £100,000. Stone Family Foundation is a relatively small family foundation based out of the UK. They focus absolutely in the Pioneer Gap. They're not technology funders as such. Where they focus is really on the business model, validation, and the management processes that set enterprises up for success in pursuing later stage investment. VentureWell is not actually a funder at all. They run a funding program for the Lemelson Foundation, primarily focused on entrepreneur teams based out of U.S. universities, but not exclusively. So there are some opportunities available to folks outside of their U.S. university network. And then finally, the Demo Environment Program is a Swedish government program with a direct technology transfer mandate. This program is actually set to close in 2020 unless it is extended, but we wanted to highlight it as an example, understanding that technology transfer resources may be a good kind of sub-pocket of resources for Sanitech entrepreneurs to investigate. And finally, I wanted to just call out Development Innovation Ventures. It's USAID's Open Innovation Program. We did not do a full profile of this opportunity in our report because it only came online again just as we were closing out our process, but we did want to call it out as an interesting opportunity for Sanitech entrepreneurs. They've changed up their stages of funding a bit. They've added an evidence generation stage, which is really interesting given that what we were just discussing about the need for robust evidence within the sanitation sector. So all of that is positive, and you can find more on their website. So again, I want to ask a question of you guys. What other examples of enterprise philanthropy stand out to you within the Sanitech funder landscape? Anything that's really compelling, any donors that you find operating in the space that we didn't mention, and certainly understanding we have others in the database that we didn't speak to right now.
And Amanda, we got some feedback that we might have some slow typers, so we want to make sure that we leave the box up.
Yes, well, thank you for making that point. So yes, if anybody has examples of enterprise philanthropy resources they want to share, please feel free. And if we do happen to move on and something else pops into your head later, feel free to add it to the chat box. Someone is saying, you know what, the paucity of resources in this sphere stands out to them. And I think that's, a reasonable statement that given the scope of the need, there aren't, unlimited resources, but there are some targeted opportunities that are available. Okay, well, all of you think on that question a little bit more. Would love to keep us rolling so that we make sure that we have plenty of time to discuss at the end.
Amanda, there's a question, oops, on that box about how relevant is the SBIR funds in the U.S.
Yes, so I think this is a good point that there are some funding mechanisms within the U.S. that are really geared towards helping entrepreneurs navigate the pioneer gap. We tried to focus on those resources that are not kind of exclusive to one geography or another unless it was those priority geographies. I will need to go back and see the flexibility of funding global efforts through US-based government funding. I know there sometimes are pathways for that, sometimes they are not. But I would love to kind of explore that a bit more and come back with a more thorough response later. Great. Okay. So now to turn to blended finance, I again love this quote from Global Impact Investing Network because I think it does speak to the essence of this kind of bucket of funding. They say it is important for donors to understand that often when trying to entice someone to wade into uncharted waters, it's valuable to present them with the opportunity to dip their toes in first rather than requiring them to plunge right in. And so I think that definitely speaks to how blended finance is kind of structured, that we use philanthropic dollars or development finance to actually crowd in, to incentivize later stage investment dollars that otherwise would never touch the sanitation sector or some of these geographic contexts that we all as practitioners hold as our priority. So blended finance, we found, holds potential, but it is not yet optimized for the Sanitech entrepreneurs that we've been discussing today. Now, blended finance is really coming on strong. It's garnering a lot of attention and has seen sizable growth in the last few years. So Convergence, which is the network of blended finance, notes that over 100 billion with a B US dollars has been mobilized via blended finance since 2005. And they also report an average leverage factor of one development dollar for every $7 of private sector funding that is leveraged. And they've also reported a doubling of the blended finance market since 2017. So really, really a lot of change that's happening in that realm. But some of you that know the blended finance world may be scratching your heads as to why we included this in our landscape. And, on the surface, really you would be right because there is quite a mismatch right now in terms of the blended finance opportunities that are available and the needs of Sanitech entrepreneurs. So we see that across the board, those funds, blended finance funds that are focused on SDG 6 for water and sanitation, they actually constitute less than 10% of all deals. And when they are undertaken, they target large-scale infrastructure projects typically and or mature enterprises that are operating beyond the break-even point. That doesn't really map to the profile of the Sanitech entrepreneur we're talking about here. There's also a disconnect in the scale of funding that's provided. So you'll recall that Lemelson statistic of an India-based enterprise needing roughly, US $25 million over 5 to 7 years. So over the lifetime of their blueprint to scale journey. And we see that in blended finance, you're looking at a median size deal of 52 million US dollars with those projects that are focused in the realm of the wash sector. And so that's a disconnect in terms of scale. And we understand that these blended finance deals can be complex and time intensive. It makes sense that then the transactions are higher, they're bigger in size. But again, it does just present a bit of a disconnect with the needs of the Sanitech entrepreneur. But that's current state, current scenario. And what we see is that there is a lot more in terms of experimentation and innovation that can happen within the blended finance community that may position this to be a really attractive opportunity space for Sanitech entrepreneurs in the months and years to come. But that's going to require a good bit of leadership and creativity to figure out exactly how to right-size blended finance for Sanitech entrepreneurs. The Lemelson Foundation came out with some ideas, starting point to kind of get people thinking about how you drive blended finance into the Pioneer Gap. And they suggest mechanisms that actually sit at those transition points that we pointed out previously that are particularly challenging for entrepreneurs to navigate. So they suggest a proof of concept fund that makes US $50,000 to $500,000 investments in those firms that are transitioning from blueprint to validate stages. And then a working capital fund to finance day-to-day operations, equipment costs as enterprises prepare for market entry. So again, one of those key transition points that enterprises and entrepreneurs face. And so Lemelson has done some thinking on this, but certainly there are lots of other ways to explore the potential for blended finance moving forward. One of the reasons we really were heartened and encouraged and wanted to include this in our findings was that we see evidence that experimentation is already underway, and impact investors express sincere appetite for learning and collaboration within the sanitation sector. So when speaking with impact investors and fund managers, we heard they understand the impact potential of the sanitation sector. They do not have to be sold on sanitation. And they are getting increasingly creative about how they structure their lending and their provision of resources such that the beneficiaries are enterprises and not just sending funding through existing financial institutions and own lending. That's a typical approach that they use. They are starting to play with enterprise finance. And the investors we spoke to do express an appetite to learn more about sanitation. They kind of understand that when they are providing resources in a sector, there's a natural learning process that occurs. And because their exposure to sanitation has been less than perhaps other sectors, they do have a lot to learn. And so they're eager to work with others in doing that. And, I think we do have to face the tough reality that if we aren't creative, if we aren't willing to experiment and see the ways that we could maneuver within the realm of blended finance, we likely will see status quo conditions persist, that Pioneer Gap resources will remain difficult to find, that the evidence base and the pilot testing and all the really rich activities that happen in those validate and prepare stages, they occur kind of more on a one-off incremental fashion. And so those the need to experiment on the financing side is really important alongside the need to experiment on the product and service delivery side within sanitation. Again, just want to kind of present some signals as to why we feel like the blended finance opportunity is really maturing and becoming more of a possibility. Just in the last many months since we initially went to print with this report, some new activities are happening that we wanted to call your attention to. So just last month, the MacArthur Foundation launched the Catalytic Capital Consortium, which is actually focused on driving resources into that catalytic space that would then be leveraged by impact investors. And their goal is to actually extend the reach of impact investing for solving and addressing the SDGs. While this consortium doesn't necessarily have a sanitation focus, certainly it falls within the realm of the priorities within the SDGs. Another announcement is that came since we went to print. The African Urban Sanitation Investment Fund was announced, and this effort is meant to drive $500 million US dollars in new citywide inclusive sanitation investments on the African continent, and about 30% of those funds are kind of dedicated to non-sewered sanitation opportunities. So again, more to learn, more to see out of this new fund, but a promising announcement and intention to engage creatively within the sanitation space. And I think all of this kind of drives home the point that, I think the community as a whole, the funder landscape as a whole, entrepreneurs and funders, investors are kind of waking up to the idea that there's serious potential to be unlocked within the Pioneer Gap, and that more focused resources within this sphere holds potential to address key investment barriers that really get to some of the questions that later stage investment or investors have, and holds the potential to unlock private capital earlier in the blueprint to scale journey. So again, I would love to pause and hear from you all as to the other types of blended finance initiatives or funders that merit mention within this opportunity space. Who are we missing? Or maybe you are not convinced and you don't really see blended finance as an opportunity yet. In your opinion, what needs to change to make blended finance a viable option? So yeah, I want to just pause here and make sure that we capture your feedback.
Amanda, there's a question about whether the presentation will be available to folks after the webinar.
Yes, we are recording, and we will be putting the recording with the slides on our website, where you can also download the report and database, and we'll be sure to follow up afterwards with a link so that will be easy to find for you all. Okay, we'll just hold here for another minute to see if you have any specific ideas around the blended finance piece. Maybe a sense that blended finance is evolving, but sanitation still remains a pretty low priority. I think that is the case. One of the things that came out in this landscaping is that so many of the funders and the initiatives we see are really moving to sector agnostic and geographically agnostic lending and funding, and so you're not just quote unquote competing for resources within your own sector anymore. You're really having to make a good case for why you are a good investment vis-a-vis health and agricultural and renewable energy and all the other sectors that are also trying to attract investment. And so that really is upping the ante for Sanitech entrepreneurs in making their case. So I would love to hear more, one of the ideas that was just received says, I think we are putting the cart before the horse in some instances. We are forgetting the beyond the pioneer issues. I would love to hear a little bit more elaboration of that, what you think are the beyond the pioneer issues, just so I make sure that I'm fully understanding that comment. So if you wanted to add your clarification in the chat box, I would love to kind of turn to just the last little bit of content to share with you all, and then we can get into our Q&A session, which I know we want to have some great dialogue there. I think one of the points that our team really wanted to make was certainly funders, donors, investors, they represent an important part of the funder landscape. But the funder landscape does not begin and end just with individual resource providers. There's a whole world of resources that are available to Sanitech entrepreneurs who are seeking out funding for their innovation, their initiative. And a few of those that are highlighted here, and they are described in more detail in our report. We find that funder and investor networks are a really great place to go and learn, what are these funders talking about? What is high on their priority list? What trends are they seeing? Just really understanding that point of view. Funder and investor networks are a great place to learn, and a few examples are listed. You also have innovation accelerators. We've seen, kind of a massive growth in innovation accelerators over the last many years. Some of these have actual mandates and objectives for connecting innovators and investors. So they actually provide that matchmaking function within their innovation accelerator programming. I do want to specifically call out the Toilet Board Coalition's accelerator is actively accepting applications right now through the end of the month. So that's an opportunity that's happening right now that may be worth investigating. There are also a number of funder repositories that are basically like online databases that you can search to understand, especially within the donor community, who is funding what's their history of resource provision, what are their active calls, just another great place to learn and prioritize and just really be open to different ideas, and perhaps be open to some more unusual suspects perhaps within the funder landscape. And then the final resource we wanted to highlight are those financing facilitators. We mentioned one here, USAID's WASH-FIN program, which is managed by Tetra Tech. They actually work hand in hand with enterprises and do a number of technical assistance activities and just advisory work to help position enterprises for success when actually going out and seeking resources, trying to become investment ready. And so this is a great resource. We have a full profile of WASH-FIN in our report, but this kind of element of financing facilitators is very important within this landscape. Our database right now features 64 promising leads that split across the 3 geographies I mentioned, Bangladesh, India, and South Africa, as well as globally relevant actors that operate in more than those specific geographies. Most of the featured funders have active WASH sector investments. Some are in closely adjacent sectors such as waste to energy. And so I do want to just state that, the database should be considered as a starting point. Absolutely additional investigation, clarifying fit with your own enterprise, your own priorities is a necessary next step. So please do not consider this database as finished or complete in any way. We're actively growing it, we're actively refining it. It will change. We encourage you to check back on our website as updates are made available. But I do want to caution you that it should be considered a preliminary resource. And so, yeah, this is our kind of final question. Just wondering if you have other resources that you found useful as you're going through the resource seeking process. Where do you turn for information? What resources do you find to be particularly helpful? I think would just love to hear from you all. And I do want to come back to John. So yes, the FSG Beyond the Pioneer Report Scaling barriers occur at 4 distinct but related levels: the firm itself, the industry value chain, public goods relevant to industry, government laws, policies, and actions. Thank you, John. Really appreciate that, and he's provided a link here. You're definitely speaking to the innovation ecosystem, right? And the broader context in which these entrepreneurs and these enterprises are operating. I think you're absolutely right that that has to be taken into consideration. And I personally am going to look forward to reviewing that resource and seeing how it might fit within our exploration of the Sanitation Technology Funder Landscape. I'm an innovation ecosystem enthusiast, so I will be excited to kind of dive into that. Okay, so so that's a great resource that has come to light during this webinar. Any others that you'd like to put on the table at this point? And I do want to come back. Kirsten provided input on the question of the SBIR, funding availability. And she lets us know that currently there aren't any open calls for sanitation technology, but past government agency funders include the National Science Foundation, NASA, and the Army. And I'll move this link over here to the chat box in case anyone is interested in learning more. And we do understand that SBIR is typically limited to U.S. small companies and universities, though some exceptions do exist. So yes, the geographical question is one that we have to take into consideration. We have another contribution on Pioneer Gap resources. The website globalwaters.org WashPals. Thank you for sharing that. All right, great. And again, we can kind of move forward, and if you have other ideas that come to mind, please do put them in the chat box, and we'll be cataloging those after the webinar. So to kind of bring us to a conclusion point here, I do think that all of us who are working with Sanitech entrepreneurs, if you are a Sanitech entrepreneur yourself, we can appreciate that the path to transformative impact is not paved. Certainly, patience and persistence is going to be needed as you're navigating the Pioneer Gap and trying to find resources to validate your new technologies, business models, and prepare for market entry. And I want to leave you with one last quote. I have come back to this a good bit in my work with STEP and find encouragement in it, and perhaps you will as well. It's a quote from F.H. Burnett that says, "At first people refuse to believe that a strange new thing can be done. Then they begin to hope it can be done. Then they see it can be done. Then it is done, and all the world wonders why it was not done centuries ago." So I think it's important for all of us to stay persistent and patient in this effort to improve the sanitation conditions in the countries we know and care about, and being led by the entrepreneurs that we are all encouraged and inspired by. I want to say thank you to all the folks who contributed to this work. Especially our research team, Shirag Devani, Samaya Maz, and Arpit Jan, who provided wonderful contributions into this work. And so now I want to turn it back to you all and ask, what are your questions? We have, a little bit more time to spend together. Would love to just kind of make this a back and forth discussion for the last remaining minutes. I think if you just want to drop your questions into the chat box, that would be terrific, and we can kind of call them out as we see them.
Looks like Kimberly and John are typing something, so we're looking forward to seeing what those questions are or comments. Amanda, I did want to point out that John also had presented another link there to beamexchange.org. So just to note for all that there's another resource available.
Terrific. So John is asking, how can we reduce the transaction costs per enterprise to access these resources? It is such a high transaction cost to get a deal done on both the enterprise and the donor side. Yes, absolutely. The transaction costs, I'm glad that you brought that point up. This was a point of discussion. I don't know how many of you all were at FSM5 in Cape Town in February, but I heard a lot of conversations about, making sure that enterprises are investment ready. And, one of the questions that kept coming to mind for me was, well, what does that mean? And are we really giving enterprises, and specifically the entrepreneurs within them, a clear roadmap to what it means at each stage to be investment ready? Whether that's an investment from a philanthropic donor, a bilateral aid agency, maybe a later stage impact investing. And, I don't think we have those ready-made resources available right now to lower the transaction costs. But I personally see that as an important opportunity moving forward. And if you have ideas, would love to hear them. Maybe that's training resources for enterprises. Maybe that's more kind of collective dialogue back and forth. If there are umbrella organizations that can serve the role of reducing those transaction costs. I think certainly for us, just trying to get this information out there in the database and in this landscape report, we are trying to kind of address that question of the early stage searching for resources. How do we lower that burden? But again, there is just a ton of legwork that has to happen. Kimberly, well, thanks for your kind comments. Curious if we were working on our research, you found any particular sanitation business models that investors are already interested in or have the most promise for enterprise philanthropy? Well, this is terrific. Thanks, Kimberly, for this question. Actually, we did a corollary set of work on business models for community and public toilets in India, trying to really understand where are the pockets of creativity and innovation happening right now. I think, where I'm seeing opportunity is the intersection of sanitation service provision and kind of digital information platforms, and how much that the integration of digital can actually start to address some of those business model barriers, the barriers to scale that just a traditional brick and mortar enterprise is going to have challenges addressing. So that report, actually, if you have an interest in business models, that also is on the STEP website. And it really is trying to just showcase other groups that are doing interesting work. So happy to provide that link later. In terms of trends, I think, I have to step back and really look at some of the other pockets of business model innovation that's happening. Because right now it does still feel like the world is quite fragmented. Okay, we just have another minute here. So I want to capture any remaining questions that you might have. And certainly, yes, the database is online. So if you go to the report, there's actually a separate download this resource link under the report that you can actually download the database directly. So you have to do that separately from downloading the report. Okay, so different levels of technology. I do think that, kind of the scope of investment is really important to take into consideration if you're talking about a component technology versus a full-scale operational omniprocessor, for example, which is community level fecal sludge management innovation. So, I think all of those considerations have to come into account as we're looking out into the funder landscape. And the database actually tries to kind of portray scale of investment and risk appetite. I think it really does get to a question of risk appetite on behalf of the donor or investor, and also kind of comfort level with technology. We heard a lot of the funders say, look, we are willing to make bets on what the market will do. We are not willing to make bets on the technology side, whereas some other funders are more interested and able to take risk on the tech. So it really is about knowing more about the risk appetite of this particular funders. Would anybody fund the idea or for the POC? I'm not sure if that question is quite clear to me. I would love for you to maybe add in a bit more explanation, Praveen, if you wouldn't mind, and I can try to respond. I am seeing that we are at time, so I want to just highlight a few final resources. You can click these links to download the full report, and then the secondary link to download the database will be just under that. If you have any problems, feel free to email me. My email address is here, and I can help you navigate to the resources. If you are not part of our newsletter, we absolutely welcome that. As Kirsten mentioned, we'll be running more webinars in the future, and we're all the time putting new resources out. And so we would love to be able to keep you abreast of that. So please, join our newsletter if you are so interested. And then finally, here's a link to that survey to give us your feedback on today, and so that we can make sure that we're really setting up these webinars in the future in a way that work for you and provide you valuable input and insight. All right.
Thank you all for coming.
Cameron,
thank you, Amanda, for the great presentation.
Well, thanks. Thank you all for your time. I'll flip back to this slide just to say thank you. Look forward to hearing from you if you need anything else. And we just hope you have a wonderful rest of your day wherever you happen to be. And we look forward to hearing from you if you have any additional needs. So thank you all so much.